Hi everyone, welcome to round 4 of Australs. My name is Joel, the chair of the round. So we currently have Auckland 1 in the affirmative and ANU 2 in the negative. We'll be beginning the debate now. Can we have the first affirmative from Auckland to rise to the stand?
Just checking that I'm audible. When North Korea fires a missile test over the South China Sea, or when China aggressively postures about its control in that region, two developed states are more worried than anyone else. This is South Korea and Japan. These are two states with shared geopolitical interests and compatible economies that are currently reliant on the unreliable partner of the United States. South Korea should make the most of this opportunity and should improve its geopolitics by forging closer ties with Japan. I'm going to talk to you about why Japan is likely to accept this and why this is good both in terms of your geopolitical stance and your economic situation. First, just in terms of some context, what do we think South Korean interests here, particularly with regard to this type of deal, are? No, first, we think this is likely primarily about security and geopolitics, right? South Korea has a highly aggressive neighbor to the border that repeatedly threatens it with nuclear weapons, and they have China asserting control over the South China Sea nearby, which is important economically as a trading route. Further, we tell you that they also they currently have an unreliable partner in the form of the United States, as I'll elaborate on. That means they want to forge not only political links, but economic links. That means they can rely on another party to support their security going forward. Further, we tell you that in terms of economic interests, South Korea has a highly skilled high-tech industry that is currently facing increased competition as lots of the rest of the world develops. As such, they're looking for the types of partnerships that companies such as Intel, with its collaboration between the United States and Israel, get, that allow them to diversify their economic and educational base, allow them to grow for further technological development, and keep their economy going strong. Okay. Why isn't the status quo? We tell you the biggest reason that South Korea and South Korea and Japan do not currently have closer economic links is primarily historical. The way Japan acted during the Second World War has left a major harm on South Korean society historically, and which has precluded this type of development earlier. Why is it now acceptable to get around this? First, we just tell you that a lot of the generation involved in the Second World War no longer make up the political majority, but second, we tell you that there are now greater pressing concerns that overwhelm this historical concern. That means that it is no longer a barrier. Further, we just tell you if South Korea, as the wrong party, makes the first move, it's unlikely to be a barrier. A second reason we tell you this isn't status quo is just due to US hegemony, which means it's meant that they've been able to focus energies on other relationships and they haven't need to put the energy on this. And at the moment, however, the United States, particularly given the strong showing by isolationist Republicans still in the midterms, but also just in terms of the fact that it is currently distracted by the war in Ukraine, is not a reliable partner anymore and just cannot be relied on to support this relationship anyway. Third, why particularly with regard to economic relationships have they not been formed? We tell you particularly because there's the separate historical development that I just told you about, and this alignment didn't occur early, there's historically been a relatively high barrier to actually providing the regulatory alignment that's needed to take advantage of this economic situation. We tell you this can be overcome with direct effort, as I'll explain later, but we tell you that it is not like... So in conclusion, there are three specific reasons this relationship didn't form historically despite being mutually beneficial that are likely to go away. What do we tell you this type of things looks like? We tell you first in terms of economics, it looks like things like an expanded free trade zone. We tell you it looks like things like the Australia-New Zealand Standards Authority being formed between these states to improve economic alignment, which means that you can just sell products more easily. We tell you it looks like improved worker visas. We tell you it looks like educational visas. We tell you it looks like basically anything that makes economic links between the nations stronger and thus more stable. Further, we tell you that regular meetings, we tell you this also looks like regular meetings, joint exercises between militaries, mutual defence pact, or like increased arms sales between the two states. Anything that makes this relationship more stable, we think it would broadly expand. Okay, why is Japan likely to reciprocate? A lot of the context I just spent 4 minutes explaining to you also applies to Japan. It's in a very similar geopolitical situation. It has the same worries. As such, it's particularly likely to want another wealthy, powerful, stable state to agree with it and align to help them deal with these challenges. But further, we tell you they're also particularly worried about, in the face of an aging economy, growing the economy further, and making sure that they can stay ahead of this. Just in terms of why they're not going to be protectionist about their economy, we tell you there's little direct competition between Japanese and South Korean states. We tell you this looks like things, but like Mitsubishi and Hyundai both having heavy industries that actually don't compete with each other directly and thus are able to align with each other. So, for example, Hyundai might build ships, whereas Mitsubishi builds aircraft, which means that these industries can align and support each other with shared economic advances that are not going to be directly in competition. Okay, moving now into why this is good. First, why this is directly politically good. But no, we tell you it needs to be economic as well as political, because economic links will ensure that this is a stable relationship which South Korea can rely on in the future. As such, it's not good enough for negative if they want to try and say, oh, but we can only do part of this relationship. This relationship only works if it's mutual. Okay, so why is it politically beneficial? First, we just tell you now in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, you're actually able to just have a major political bloc that stands up and opposes China. We tell you this looks like things like proposing whatever the things are called that oppose China, having voting support, which A, is good because you've now got two wealthy states doing it, but B, it likely allows other states that would otherwise be opposed to China but are scared because they are worried about alienating themselves to join in, because they now know that they've got a stable trading partner that they can join in on, which means that on a second level, China is unlikely to be able to manipulate these regional bodies in a way that's beneficial for it. But second, we tell you you provide an important alternative economic source of loans in these regions. Under status quo, you essentially have two choices as a developing nation in the South Pacific. You can either take loans from the IMF and the World Bank, which likely have such severe conditions because they're designed to be ways of promoting neoliberal economics that you're never going to take them, or you can take a loan from China, which has no conditions attached except that you vote in the UN. What we tell you South Korea and Japan can do through things like SoftBank collaborating with the governments means they've now got access to immense amounts of capital that they would not have otherwise to provide these types of loans without major conditions other than you are going to vote with us or you are not going to automatically vote with China, which means that you can guarantee the independence of these small states, which means that trade regulations in the regions are likely going to be better to you. Third, we tell you it means you've got a stronger military deterrent in the region. Now, this is really important in the context of North Korea because it means that South Korea no longer has to worry that it's going to be left alone if the US decides to renege on its commitments. It can at least be ensured that Japan is likely to back it up. No, Japan doesn't like North Korea. It's likely to provide the support at the point these relationships are formed. But further, we tell you it's particularly good for South Korea because Japan has a de facto nuclear umbrella in the fact that it is nearly able to produce nuclear weapons at the point it wants to. This means that South Korea is brought under this protection. It's unlikely to be subject to further ones. And four, we tell you this allows you to do other things in the South China Sea. But as a fifth layer of analysis as to why this is good, for geopolitics, the rest of the world will be quite happy, particularly the Western Europe and the United States, that Southeast Asia is protecting itself. As such, they're likely to engage in further support for this. Okay, so this secures your geopolitics. Why is this economically good? First, we tell you it's compatible industries, like I told you with Hyundai and Mitsubishi, but it's also things like Samsung and Sony, which despite operating in similar regions, don't directly compete with us. Further, we tell you that they've got relatively similar corporate structures in the forms of chaebol and the South Korean and the Japanese conglomerates. This means they understand how to do business with each other and they're able to uniquely collaborate in a way. Third, we told, as I explained to you earlier, the barriers are likely circumstantial that evolve due to a lack of historicity rather than some inherent proximity. First, we just tell you these corporations are going to be able to collaborate better. That's going to be really good. Second, we tell you all of the normal free market stuff. You've got a better effective market. You're likely going to get better products for consumers. That's really good. Third, we tell you these corporations can engage in direct joint connections. And four, due to the geographic proximity, you are likely going to get more efficient collaboration between them. For all of the reasons that economic growth is really important, particularly when you've got an aging, slowing economy, this is really good. Even if it's not economically beneficial on its own, it's an essential step to preserving South Korean geopolitical stability.
All right, thank you very much. Can we invite the first negative speaker to introduce the case for negative? Here.
Cool, am I audible? Yeah, awesome. You skip papers in order. Start. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. It is ludicrous when South Korea is increasingly concerned about the incredibly invasive nuclear testing that has been happening in such close proximity to them, when that anxiety infiltrates into your citizens to pursue a relationship that is directly antagonistic with China, to the point where China, being the main mediator between North Korea and South Korea, means that you are going to increase that instability that is so near you, that increases the anxiety of your citizens. At that point, you ought to pursue a relationship that better stabilizes your region and helps you achieve your most important incentive, which is to make sure that your relationship with North Korea is much better. I'm going to talk here about the incentives of what South Korea wants, how this deteriorates your relationship with China, which is so crucial to maintaining that stability with North Korea, and then why this is likely an economically bad idea for them to do. Okay, let's talk about what the incentives of South Korea are, because I think primarily that means stability with North Korea, and that's for a couple of reasons. That is to say that they have that North Korea has a large amount of South Korean prisoners, for example, independence leaders, and any people from North Korea trying to protect. Obviously, they want to protect their citizens and they want them to be able to make it back. The second reason is just that they are in very close proximity when they are on the border, as they are testing nuclear missiles, when they are testing ICBMs. Obviously, that is something they want to look out for. Thirdly, because North Korea is incredibly unstable and the likelihood of war is quite high. That is because they have Kim Jong-un is an incredibly erratic leader and difficult to predict. Also because they have had that increasingly invasive missile testing. And at this point, the most important incentive of South Korea is maintaining that stable relationship with them. I think the second thing to characterize here is that this necessarily entails a strong relationship with China. That is because, first of all, that is a superpower that is in the closest proximity with South Korea and that has a significant amount of control within that region. The second reason is because it is an incredibly economically powerful actor, and that power is likely going to grow over a period of time. Third of all, they also just have a revealed preference for valuing China. For example, the fact that they see that China has managed to lift millions of people out of poverty over the past few decades, and the fact that there is extreme income inequality in South Korea means they often show that they have a revealed preference for, just generally they like Xi Jinping and so on. The third incentive here that South Korea has is that they just want economic prosperity. Obviously, that is just good for their long-term growth and reducing inequality. What does the current relationship look like with Japan? And I think that is probably quite bad. That is quite bad. That is because it is already characterized by tensions. For example, Japan has removed them from their most favored trading partner list. They have also released nuclear waste into that country after the events of Fukushima, which resulted in huge protests from the South Korean people and the government condemnation of Japan. Obviously, increasing your ties with Japan would severely piss off the South Korean people, but also just because Japan generally has more support from the West and more power from them, and therefore they would just probably benefit more asymmetrically from this deal than they would. I think this means the impact ultimately is that any sort of economic impacts that this has will favor Japan hugely, and they will probably they will get the better end of this deal regardless. Okay, let's talk about the most important point here, which is how this deteriorates your relationship with China, because I think a key piece of characterization that goes missing from that affirmative speech is that China absolutely hates Japan, and as a result, when South Korea doesn't want to piss off China in order to stabilize their North Korean region, that is something you absolutely do not want to do when you create that tipping point where you form your relationship with Japan. Okay, why does China hate Japan? 5 reasons for this. First of all, Japan is part of the Quad, which aims to counter the influence of China in that region, including India, Australia, and the US. Second of all, Japan has just generally expressed disinterest in trading with China. They've also been incredibly antagonistic in that, and China has likewise responded to that. Thirdly, just because of historical reasons, for example, war crimes in Nanking, in Manchuria, that Japan has never formally apologized for. Fourthly, China sees them largely as a puppet for the US, given that Japan has no military, but they are backed by the military from the US. They just see that as sort of basically an outpost of the US within this region. And fifthly, they have very competing economies on tech. Obviously, China has engaged in anti-competitive measures to basically spread Huawei into Australia and so on, where they can dominate that market because they have competing economies. Obviously, they are not particularly, they basically hate Japan, and pursuing any sort of relationship with Japan would likely be a tipping point for South Korea losing their relationship with China. Why is South Korea currently friendly with China? That's for 2 main reasons. First of all, that China views South Korea as essentially the weakest link of the US in the Southeast Asia region, and therefore they can exert a significant amount of influence over them. The second reason is that China is currently South Korea's biggest trading partner. That is because Taiwan is the biggest producer of semiconductors and chips, but they export exclusively to the US, which means that China imports most of their, basically all of their chips from South Korea. What this is likely to mean what happens here is that you basically piss off China to the point where that is going to cause you massive harms. Also, just note that if you be friends with China, obviously that alleviates any of their benefits in the South China Sea. If you're friends with them, they're not going to be mad at you there. But I think this is also important here because this relationship is a tipping point in causing China to deteriorate their relationships with South Korea. That is because, one, it results in a reduction of trade when you start working with Japan. Second of all, when you create that intelligence trading triangle with the US and Japan, that is the point at which, when there is more than just a couple of lines of communication, when that is a clear group, that becomes far more intimidating to China and something that they need to be aware of. And thirdly, also, China is just very willing to abandon South Korea as a trading partner because they can easily go elsewhere because of their Belts and Roads initiatives. And probably at the very worst in our world, what this looks like is they stop trading everything with South Korea except maybe chips. So the impact of this point is incredibly important because China, and that is basically all to do with their relationship with North Korea. That is to say that North Korea is incredibly good friends with China because they are basically China is North Korea's most stable trading partner. They help develop their nuclear weapons, and therefore China has often used this influence to have a mediating influence between South Korea and North Korea. What is likely to happen when you reach that tipping point of reducing your relationships with China to the extent that this happens in this world is China is likely to encourage North Korea to be more aggressive, and also they are likely to just help North Korea deal with the fallout of any of the things they do that are break international laws, because any sort of sanctions that the UN imposes on North Korea can just easily be helped by China's trade. Also note that China can very easily insulate themselves from international criticism here. That is because they are a permanent member of the Security Council. They can just veto those sanctions, or they can just trade using those Belts and Roads initiatives. I think what that means is you probably have you never get China to encourage North Korea to be more stable in this region. What that looks like is them keeping prisoners like North Koreans trying to defect to South Korea, like those independence leaders and like other South Korean citizens. It also means you get more invasive nuclear tests and you get more instability on the border. That is incredibly critical in this debate because it massively impacts the anxiety of South Koreans. When we are talking about South Korea, you would presume that is South Korean citizenry, and that means you are likely to get far worse outcomes for them in terms of being worried about how that nuclear program is going to affect them and how North Korea affects them. I think also, thirdly, they just want effective ties with China generally in terms of economics as well. This obviously weakens those ties. Again, note that you probably don't need to worry about the South China Sea being a bad thing for you if you are friends with China. Finally, let's talk about the economy here, because I think Japan is a uniquely bad economic actor to partner with. That is because, first of all, it has an aging population. With fewer people entering the labor force, that means you have a far more stagnating economy, which makes you uniquely poor to engage with. Second of all is that currently South Korea is already in the status quo able to maintain that US trade with China. That is because they are within that region. The mechanism here is essentially that the US is concerned with their proximity to China and therefore still trades with them to keep them on side. So that economy already works very effectively in the status quo, but also note that any additional trade with China probably is just good for South Korea given that proximity and them being probably a more powerful actor into the future. At the end of this, the most important thing you ought weigh in this debate is their relationship with China in terms of how it affects North Korea. Incredibly proud to oppose.
Right, we thank the first NEC for that speech. Can we have the second affirmative speaker? Here.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Note, at no point in that speech did you hear any analysis as to why South Korea is so dependent on China that it needs to keep its relationship alive in the face of all of the other threats that China is posing to South Korea. It needs another ally to pose a formidable opponent in the region. I think all of the analysis that they gave why China is a uniquely terrible partner is exactly why we need to start looking elsewhere to protect ourselves in that region. Our two paths to victory still stand in this debate. Firstly, the political benefit that we'll gain, and secondly, the economic benefit. Firstly, I'll just remind you of all of the reasons why Japan and South Korea are going to form economic relations that Harry told you in his speech. Firstly, they said that these historical reasons are exactly why they aren't going to band together in today's day and age. Well, I think that is incredibly unlikely that Japan is going to like not apologize for things that happened in the past, right? And even if it isn't apologetic, I don't think that it's like currently such a topical issue in South Korea that would be the one thing that is barring them from entering into relations from each other. I think that all of the analysis that Harry explained to you about why this was basically just the reason why this economic relationship or diplomatic ties haven't happened before still stand. But secondly, I think that they ignored all of the material that we gave you about that these two nations are facing a new increasing threat in the form of China and North Korea. They tried to tell you that China is basically the only thing keeping North Korea at bay, but that's literally the opposite of what's true, right? Is that China is directly fanning the flames of North Korea by giving them access to things that they can use to build missiles, by giving them access to things that they can use to build weaponry. That means that by like enabling them to continue the authoritarian regime, China is fanning the flames rather than being the mediator. In fact, we think that the mediator is actually a nation like the US, and we also gave you, which is my third reason why they're going to form relations, which is why we need them right now, right? We need each other because the US and European protection, which would have otherwise been the other mediator between us and North Korea, doesn't exist anymore. They're all distracted with something that's going on in their own backyard with the Ukraine situation. They're unlikely to be able to step in when we do see missiles flying over Japan literally right now. They said that then the only reason that they gave that Japan was a bad actor, not that that was in the last 10 seconds of the first speaker's speech, was because that Japan is an aging population. I think that they had a much bigger burden to actually explain why that's a necessarily bad thing, right? And that the fact that Japan still has an incredibly high-tech economy with lots and lots of different industries that are compatible with South Korea still exists. It's unlikely that this is going to be a significant factor in the debate. And even if, I think that South Korea probably is able to complement that by providing other workers and more youth into the economy. Okay, so I think this means that we've flipped all of the reasons why they won't join forces, because I think that then they tried to tell that they will be angry at each other because they don't like that they're both US Sims. Firstly, they're both very, very well-known US allies, right? Japan has been a very strong ally with the US, just as South Korea has been, because they're both seen really cool liberal democracies in Asia, which US and Europe see as something that's in their own interest. So that means that not only will they like align with each other because they have those similar former allies, but they also will align with each other to please those allies, to mean that they're able to easily form economic relations with the US and diplomatic ties will be strengthened there. But this means that this isn't going to be a major factor in them banding together. Okay, turning back to the political benefit that we then showed you that we did get on our side, because how does all of Harris's analysis still stand on the two threats that are faced by both of these countries? Firstly, we have China, and that when we are able to band together, all of the analysis that we gave you about the two alternatives that we proposed to the Asian region still stand. Firstly, we still get that theological alternative, right? The fact that other countries in ASEAN now have an alternative when they want to, grow their own nation, they can start to look towards liberal democracy ideals because they have a partner to deal with when they then want to enter trade relations. But secondly, all of the analysis that Harry gave you about loans still exist, right? When you band together, you have more money around that you can give out to countries like Vietnam, give out to countries like Thailand to build major infrastructure projects that have more favorable conditions for you and the block that you want to build in your geographical area. They then said, moving then to why North Korea is going to be easier to solve when you're banded together. Firstly, because you're now proposing a united approach, right? China isn't the only thing that's holding North Korea back. The only thing that's holding North Korea back is the fact that they don't have enough resources to become a major destructive power at this point. So when you're proposing a united approach, you can then make conditions on North Korea that are very clear and very easily to distinguish when they've gone too far and not. But secondly, it's also just a further deterrent, right? When you're proposing a united approach, it's not just the fact that you can have a united diplomatic message that you're sending to North Korea, it's also the fact that you're a military alliance now. The fact that when North Korea sends missiles over Japan, they're not just pissing off Japan, they're pissing off South Korea as well. And that means that it's less likely that you face that threat very, very aggressively with with that. Okay, this means then that you're likely to have many political benefits to your region, to both of your countries when you band together. None of their analysis about why China will be angry is just not standing in this debate. Why is China not going to be like, this miracle worker that they try and propose it as? Firstly, because your relationship, and this is with South Korea and Japan both, is already deteriorating. Firstly, because they're both US allies already. China's already angry at South Korea for being someone that regularly sides with the US. But secondly, because of the fact that they're not authoritarian, or they don't agree with the kinds of ways that China conducts itself in the South China Sea, and that they regularly announce that displeasure on the international stage, meaning that China is already not such a favorable ally in this region. But secondly, even if you believe any of that analysis there, the burden is on them to prove why. Sorry, did someone's unmuted? No. Okay, I'll continue. I'm at 6:30. Okay, the burden is on their side to prove why, even if I've just proved to you why this relationship is already naturally deteriorating, the burden is on them to prove why it makes this relationship so significantly worse that it would outweigh all of the benefits that I've previously proven to you that you get when you ally together as Japan and South Korea. They said that maybe China will be mad and not buy chips from South Korea anymore. But China is a really, really bad trading partner for all of the reasons that they said, right? The fact that they very easily will dissolve ties, the fact that they will impose conditions on their loans, the fact that they don't respect things like international IP laws that are really, really important to you as South Korea and Japan, because that's basically what your economy is dependent on. That means then that they have a lot of work to do to prove why China is such a major alternative and such a good partner that it outweighs all of the benefits that we've proved to you politically. But we didn't just prove to you political benefits, and separate path to victory that they have to disprove is the economic benefit that you get. 3 ways that you get an economic benefit. Firstly, when you have certain import and export channels between two compatible economies, that means that you have a continuing certain boom that both of your countries need. All of the analysis that they gave you about Japan's aging population is exactly why they'll sign on and why it will be beneficial for them. But secondly, you get to decide industry directions together. You get an influence together on the automotive industries that exist in both of your countries to try and push them towards things like electric production. Secondly, you get an influence on the tech industries in both of your countries, which means that you can push them away from really bad practices of abusing employees and try and push them towards the 21st century. But importantly, it's not just an a political front against China. You need to be united economically against China. That's why we win this debate.
All right, thank you very much. Can we invite the second negative speaker to advance the next case here? Can we have the third affirmative speaker here?
Awesome, just checking that I'm audible. Cool, just give me a few seconds to get my paper. Cool, starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm just going to start the speech with a bit of a reality check, because it wasn't even good enough for them to just magically create some reasons as to why China might be a better geopolitical partner when they didn't engage with any of the reasons we gave you right from first about the specific incentives on the South Korean people, about the fact that South Korea is a modern liberal democracy, about the fact that South Korea is reliant on trade with the West, and therefore if they align with China are probably likely to lose all of that trade and all of those benefits. They can't just ignore all of that and pretend that China's this perfect partner. We gave you reasons as to why Japan is a much better, similarly large partner to have, and that doesn't alienate your other allies. Cool. 3 things to do in the speech. Firstly, looking at economic collaboration. Secondly, looking at whether China is preferred to Japan economically. And then thirdly, on geopolitics. We want to start with pretty much the only response to our entire economic collaboration benefit aside from China being an alternative partner is just to say that Japan's old. 2 reasons why this wasn't good enough. Firstly, sure, Japan might have an aging population, but they're a rich and attractive country where lots of people would want to work because they know that there are high-paying jobs there. Therefore, I think they're able to get a lot of immigration in order to stop this aging population and to keep growing. But even if they don't have this immigration, and even if Japan is now like some aging partner that isn't good enough anymore, they're still fucking huge. They're literally the 3rd largest GDP on the planet. Even if it shrinks, maybe it shrinks to like 10th in the world, which is still a really beneficial trading partner to have, in addition to all of South Korea's other partners, because again, we don't buy their assertion that China is apparently more of an important player to them than the West. Therefore, adding Japan doesn't alienate anybody. Cool, but let's look at the benefits that we told you, because we told you that actually working with tech is really beneficial and that you're able to collaborate more than it competes. Because even if you don't buy these are complementary industries, as we told you at first and second to no response, and even if you do believe that they directly compete, this is still able to help both countries. Why is that? Firstly, it's because of partnerships. The fact that even though like Samsung and Apple are directly competing, collaboration happens and is still good for both parties when Samsung is able to like make Apple screens. I think you're able to have that between South Korean and Japanese companies, even ones that work in the same industry, benefits the GDP of both. That's really good. Secondly, though, is just the unique fact of the tech sector that a development helps both companies, because a new feature that makes a computer better is able to benefit both a South Korean and a Japanese computing company, because they're able to implement that feature to both of their companies, and therefore both of them have this new attractive feature that they're able to sell, again increasing their profit, increasing their GDP. It benefits both. Pretty much their only response to this is that, oh, it might benefit Japan asymmetrically more than South Korea. Again, this was not mechanized. This is just a complete assertion. But even if it is an asymmetrical benefit, I think we're perfectly fine to have an asymmetrical benefit where South Korea still gets a 10% bump in GDP and in trade, and Japan gets a 20% bump. That's good for both partners. That's still a win for us. That's really important. But secondly, the other thing that never got responded to was all of the material we gave you about alignment. We told you about regulations, about complex taxation systems, about tariffs, about differing import quantity allowances, and about different legal structure. All of these are things that are currently different between Japan and South Korea, and when we have more of an economic collaboration, are things that are able to be fine-tuned and are things that are able to be similar, so that you're actually able to have cooperation across borders, where you're able to have a Japanese company more willing to and more able to be successful in South Korea, and vice versa. Again, that's really beneficial for both sides. That's really important. At the end of this, what do you believe? Japan and South Korea are able to make a mutually beneficial trading relationship. That's really important. Just to touch on the historical reasons about why this relationship apparently wouldn't happen. 3 responses here. Firstly, as we already told you, the population is aging. But the second thing to note is that the Japanese population has also aged. They've moved on. They no longer are particularly warmongering, as we apparently have heard. And I think that I think the most important response is that because we just explained there is an economic benefit to both sides, then since both sides are able to benefit from it, I think that Japan would also realize that it might be something good to do. I'm sure they'd be willing to concede an apology in order to get this economic benefit, in order to get this great relationship. Moving on then to whether China is preferred to Japan economically. 3 main areas to do here. Firstly, the claim we got is that the South Korean people prefer China, so there's going to be backlash. 3 responses here. Firstly, as I just explained, Japan is seen positively now. They're a similar liberal democracy. They're way more similar to South Korea as opposed to China's political structure. I think the people in South Korea realize that and are more willing to operate with Japan. Secondly, China supports North Korea. They're literally the government that is allowing the missile test that scares South Korean citizens, as both sides have admitted. I don't think that the South Korean people are blind to this, and I think they realize that by extension they hate China if they hate North Korea. But thirdly, though, China literally invaded South Korea more recently than Japan did. Note the Korean War was a thing that happened. China supported North Korea and their invasion. I don't think the South Korean people have forgotten that. I think they probably are angry about that. The second thing we hear is that South Korea is reliant on China. 3 responses here. Firstly, that was a complete assertion. I think that South Korea is a developed economy, so they've probably diversified their trading partners. Secondly, this is contradictory to their previous material that the US still trades with South Korea because they don't like the fact that South Korea might have some relationship with China. I think that directly defeats their material material here. But thirdly, note that Japan is so huge that even if they are reliant on China, South Korea is able to replace China's market with Japan. Japan is the third largest GDP on the planet. That's a huge trading partner, especially when you combine with the fact that you're probably likely to get extra Western trade from the EU, from the US, and from other Western partners who are now really happy that these liberal democracies are collaborating with each other as opposed to collaborating with China. I think that means that you're going to get all of these trade benefits and all of these geopolitical benefits from the fact that you're making your other partners more happy that you're going away from China. But the third thing to note here that we never got any response to was the fact that economics isn't just about trade. Three things here. Firstly, you want a partner that respects IP law. This was given at second, no response. That means that China is a deeply bad partner to work with when they'll just blatantly abuse South Korean patents and exploit South Korean companies' ideas. Secondly, you want a consistent, reliable trading partner that isn't going to fuck you over later, as China has done with literally every single other trading partner they have, as we've heard all throughout like the Belt and Road Initiative that they tell you about. But thirdly, it's the fact that economics is also about being able to influence markets with shared values. Again, we told you this right at first and second, that because Japan and South Korea have shared values, they're able to influence the tech and auto industries because they're now a powerhouse when they're combined. That means they're able to shape global standards in the interests of what they care about. I think that's really important for them, that's able to benefit their companies. In terms of geopolitics, I've already dealt with all of the China being pissed off material because firstly, they tell you that apparently they're reliant on South Korean chips. I don't think I think that if that is true, then that means that they can't just get mad at South Korea. But also all of the material that I gave you and we gave you down the bench about the economic ability to substitute China out for Japan and the West means that even if China does get pissed off, they can still easily replace it. I think that therefore all of the material that we gave you at first to very little response about the huge benefit in terms of being able to influence the region is the more important area in terms of geopolitics. It's the fact that you now have a powerful liberal democracy bloc in Asia that's able to give loans to stop Chinese influence. Maybe you can split the cost in two and make it more politically palatable. Maybe you just have more capital for Japanese and South Korean banks to work with. And maybe it's just the fact that now you're more of a power player and can influence smaller countries to move towards the liberal democracy values that both Japan and South Korea hold. At the end of this debate, we went on economics, we went on international relations and geopolitics. So
All right, thank you very much. Can we have the third negative speaker?
Thank you. Just give me a moment to get my paper. Starting my speech in three comparatives that have arisen in this debate. Because the first comparative we hear out of the affirmative team is that this is essentially about choosing Japan over the US because the US is like a bad ally because it's kind of distracted. Note that that is not true because choosing Japan also means choosing the US. And that is because Japan relies on the US, firstly for trade, but also for its military might. The second thing to note, though, is that this is not a debate about choosing between going to the US or going to China. That is to say, we as the negative team do not have to defend South Korea getting closer with China than they already are. That was a ridiculous burden push from the affirmative team. That is not the case in the topic and in this debate. And that is what the 3A speech misses. We only need to defend the status quo. A status quo, by the way, in which South Korea is optimally placed at the nexus of the Western world, where it has military alliances with the US and trades with the US and Australia and other Western nations. But it is also related and linked to China. Note that South Korea is seen as a stable democracy, and by their very own analysis, because it is so stable in this region, that explains why their position in the status quo is optimal. What our case explains, though, to no response, by the way, is that actively choosing Japan and by extension the US worsens relationships with China. The only responses there come out at third act, which I'll get to in a minute. Their only response is to take a humongous shit on China, deploying a classic debating xenophobia set of arguments, whereby that is completely oblivious to the status quo. And that status quo is this. China and South Korea are incredibly large trading partners, whereby China is the premier trading partner of South Korea. Secondly, China holds North Korea in check to a large extent. It has negotiated between North Korea and South Korea before, and to the extent that you believe the opposition about China funding North Korea's nuclear programs, obviously, because it is a trade partner with South Korea, it would make sure that North Korea does not deploy its missiles against South Korea. The final thing to note is that because China recognizes South Korea is semi-allied with the West, they have an ongoing interest in continuing to court South Korea. That is the position South Korea is in. They are stuck between the US and China, being courted by both. They should not change that by ultimately going for Japan. The next response that they give us is that really, I'll move on from this to the first theme in this debate, which is basically that China would be a bad trading partner, material that only comes out at third affirmative. The first two mechanisms here are basically that because China supports North Korea with nuclear weapons and because they have an authoritarian government, they're not particularly compatible with South Korea. That ignores the reality that Xi Jinping has a pretty high opinion rating in South Korea, and it also ignores the reality that South Korea and China are big trading partners, that people in South Korea value that trade and continue to want that trade. The next thing they tell us, though, is that China is somehow an unreliable trading partner. That is, first of all, incorrect. China is a huge trading partner for many nations around the world, but then they next tell us that China could easily be replaced by Japan. The issue with this argument is twofold. First of all, even if Japan is as big as they want you to believe, China is still bigger, and trading with China also means trading with many other smaller countries, for example, ones in the Belt and Road Initiative that do not cooperate with the West or Japan, and therefore you ultimately gain access to a larger number of trading partners when you go with China. The second line of response here, though, is just to note that, as in my introduction and as we have explained throughout our bench, because South Korea is already optimally placed, it does already trade with the United States. It does already have a limited amount of trade with Japan. What is important to understand is that those existing trades cannot suddenly be upregulated by the US or Japan or Australia or other Western countries or allies that the opposition wants to talk about, because they do not have the same capacity for trade as China does. The second theme I want to talk about in this debate are the benefits that they claim. Broadly, they give us two sets of benefits or two win conditions for them. Firstly, political benefits, and next, economic benefits. I'm going to first respond to each of their mechanisms in turn and then offer some global responses. First thing they tell us is that there will be a better military deterrent against North Korea when you create an alliance with Japan. The first thing to note is that Japan has no military of its own. Its military relies on the US. South Korea is already an ally of the US militarily as well. That means there is no increase in military or defense capability that South Korea gets by choosing Japan. The second line of response was our material about why this would aggravate China. Note that we give you material at Niamh that is never responded to explain why China currently tolerates South Korea's neutrality, but would not do so in a world where they increasingly move to Western nations and Japan because Japan is so allied with the US. But the final thing that the final response is that in order to have some sort of military deterrent, you need to believe that South Korea and Japan would then go and form a bloc with the rest of ASEAN, with the rest of the Quad, with the rest of the UN, or whoever else the opposition wants you to believe. And obviously, they give no mechanisms as to why that is the case. And that would not be the case because South Korea will still want to trade with China. The only other thing they tell us then is that the rest of the world will support them against like standing against China. They give no reason why it is in South Korea's interest to take a stand against China, other than the North Korea point, which we've already extensively explained to you is not real, because China is one of the main reasons that North Korea and South Korea relations are stable, if not improving. Next, they tell you about economic benefits. Firstly, they say that the industries in these countries are compatible. Firstly, I would note that there is still often competition, and that actually explains why there was a literal economic war between South Korea and Japan started in 2019 that is still ongoing. The second thing I would note here, though, is that Japan benefits a lot more, because if you buy the material about South Korean workers going to work in Japan to fix the aging population, that means Japanese industry is improved while South Korea experiences brain drain. Note that at that end of that, the relationship only benefits Japan and not South Korea. No reason South Korea should enter into that. The next thing they say is that they can share knowledge and share workers. I think the key thing here is the comparative. And that is because, as explained earlier, South Korea is already neutral. They are already have a good relationship with most other countries. In fact, the only countries they do not really get along well with are, coincidentally, Japan and to some extent North Korea. So they can already share knowledge with countries like the US, with countries like Australia. There are already exchange programs at a tertiary and also working level. Next, they tell us that these countries would somehow pressure other countries to have better working conditions. No mechanisms here. Incredibly unclear how South Korea and Japan could bilaterally achieve this if the UN and ASEAN haven't been able to achieve it next. And the final thing is that, they'll get better loans if they're not associated with China. Again, ridiculous. South Korea already gets loans. They have a AA credit rating by the World Bank. They are perfectly in place at the moment to get loans. Our global responses here, though, are that firstly, South Korea can still maintain its relationship with the West and the US as it does currently and as it does in the status quo. And secondly, that Japan benefits more, something I already explained. Our material here tells you that Japan is a bad partner due to its aging population and because there is no change in the number of allies or the number of trade partners South Korea gets when it goes to Japan. Their only response was to say, but immigration and but the aging population will motivate South Korea to help Japan. Again, this explains why Japan benefits more and is exactly the issue with this trade union and is why South Korea should not join it. At the end of this debate, please remember the real comparative, which is choosing Japan and by extension, the US means losing out on China and all of her trading partners. At the status quo, South Korea is optimally placed to take advantage of both Western nations and Japan, as well as China. That is where it should stay. It should not pursue this relationship. Proud to oppose.
All right, thanks. Can we have the negatives reply speaker to end debate for the neck here? Negative reply, can we have the affirmatives reply to end the debate as a whole here?
Okay, I unmuted. Cool, just checking I'm audible. Sweet, thank you. Look, I'm going to start with a question. What on earth does negative stand for? Do they stand for closer relationships with China that is going to lead to North Korea walking back its missile tests, which occur under status quo? Or, as third tells you, do they stand for status quo, which is not sufficient to walk back those missile tests? Unclear. They cannot claim the benefits for these two worlds. They are clearly mutually exclusive. They actually needed to provide you a cohesive explanation as to how they keep North Korea in check in a world where the major mediator of the United States is no longer at play. I'm going to talk to you about politics and then I'm going to talk to you about economics. First, though, I'm going to remind you about what the context of this debate was. That went to no response by negative, so we presume that they accept it. Maybe it's the case that China does some mediating with North Korea. The predominant mediator, though, as we told you through the forms of nuclear deals and through the forms of sanctions we told you down the bench, is the United States, a party which is increasingly isolationist, increasingly distracted by the war in Ukraine. Note, it's probably true that you can't focus on two major geopolitical crises at once, and is increasingly not able to stand here. As such, if what you want to stand for is stability, you need another liberal democratic party to step into the void filled by the United States to provide that countervailing presence against China. Unclear which world they live in today. I'm going to deal with politics, I'm going to deal with economics. What do you still believe about politics, despite all of their responses today? First, ASEAN no longer is drifting towards China because there's now actually an alternative in the form of a liberal democratic political bloc that has both China and South Korea. No, this does not exist in their world. This means you are likely to get friendlier regulations. That's really good. Second, you are able to combat Chinese predatory loans. No, they told you, oh, but they clearly didn't understand this point where they're like, oh, but loans are a bad way to make profit, or oh, but you never struggle getting loans. The point was never about them getting loans or making money. The point was very obviously to stop other states taking bad loans from China and actually providing a reasonable alternative so that these states stay aligned with you. This was clear at first, unclear what on earth they thought they were responding to here. Okay, now they told, oh, but the US... Now they tried to tell you, oh, but, you know, this deal with Japan is just going to get the US to stay in. If that's the case, great. We were clearly concerned that the United States was withdrawing. If it's the case that we bring the United States back into the fold better, that's really, really good. Now they told you, oh, but you're at an optimal nexus right now. We told you why this optimal nexus was fading and was inherently fading when the United States was becoming increasingly isolationist and withdrawing. As such, it's unlikely that you're ever going to stay in this optimal nexus, and you need to form this bloc to countervail it. This was very clear from the context and the mechanisms we gave you down the bench. No response there. Now they also told you, oh, but they can team for North Korea. I told you this in my introduction. Why haven't they done this already? We tell you the likely reason is that China wants an aggressive North Korea to try and hold South Korea in check so that they get some freedom around Southeast Asia. We make it very clear that the only way that you keep North Korea in check is likely when you replace the countervailing influence of the United States with one comprised of both Japan and South Korea, a bloc only they can do on their own. Now, just briefly about a military deterrent. Look, it's really nice of the opposing team to believe the self-defense forces aren't military. Unclear why they thought why Japan is like one of the world's largest military spenders. It's pretty clear that they are. Unclear what they're doing. At the end of this, you think that you get a political bloc that is able to hold China in check and continue mediating North Korea. On economics, what did they tell you? Oh, but Japan is bad, that's too similar. Note, a lot of the problems they say with Japan are also same with China. China is also really bad, but they don't respect IP law. The biggest problem, though, is they told you, oh, but you're really going to drop you if you align with Japan. Unclear how they can do this. We tell you all of the mechanisms they tell you that make you a good trading partner with China symmetrically mean they're not going to drop you in favor of Japan. We tell you this means that you're likely not actually making a choice between markets by their very own mechanisms. We tell you that's really good. Now, in terms of all of this stuff about competition, we explain to you quite clearly down the bench how there is actually segmentation between industries. That means they're able to collaborate and cooperate in ways that are simply not possible under status quo. What they never responded to, though, was the benefits of regulatory alignment, corporate cooperation, and free trade that we uniquely deliver. Their material was never sufficient to replace the role of the United States and its fading position in the world. It's pretty clear they've lost this debate.
All right. Thank you very much. Can I just invite all speakers to, I guess, cross the floor, shake hands, leave the room, wait for the verdict. Yeah. All right. Can I just check that I am audible?
Yep, you are.
All right. So, so I think I have one piece of general comment for this round, and it is that I think teams needed to be very specific in the way that they weight their impacting against the actor's interest in the motion. So all the benefits and harms, I think, could have benefited from a much clearer tie back to what specific interests have been outlined in first speakers, set up in first speakers. I think speakers really needed to do a lot more weighing along those lines, especially in an extra motion. But anyway, I'm going to go into the verdict. So the panel unanimously thought that the negative team won the debate. So there are three main clashes in this round for deciding who won this round. So the first is, will Japan be likely to accept this partnership? Secondly, to what extent does this partnership alienate China? Thirdly, will South Korea benefit from this relationship? So let's first discuss the issue on whether or not Japan will be likely to accept this partnership. Because I think both teams clashed significantly on this issue, gave quite a bit of airtime to this issue, but also more importantly, a lot of the benefits of this partnership was largely contingent on this Japan's buy-in. So the first thing I would point out here is that very early on in the debate, both sides agreed that there were historical atrocities that were committed and probably still remembered by their respective populations. Affirmative claims in response to the negative team's push that you are going to have a lot of difficulty getting the public's buy-in in Japan. The way that affirmative response to this is to suggest that there's a lot of or like the way they try to do it is that there are lots of like economic pressures right now, similar economic pressures that will compel Japan towards the direction of apologizing because of whatever dire straits they might be in, because of the aging population. And they also explain that it's not like, they try to explain at least, that it is not likely to be a hot button issue in Japan's elections. So I would point out that it's unclear why it's not a hot button issue in Japanese elections. I think this was a one-line response that we get from the second affirmative team. What was the more plausible set of reasons that we thought were more persuasive was this idea of like having similar economic pressures and like structural pressures around the economy that would compel you towards that apology. But it's unclear, especially how the affirmative team is able to recover from the response you get from the second negative speaker about how Japan's culture has that very strong pride and dominance in that military and things like that. And so as a consequence of that, it was more likely that Japan would be not willing to apologize. It's unclear as to why it was likely. I think there are plausible reasons that were presented through the economic pressures analysis from the affirmative team, but it was insufficient at proving the likelihood of Japan apologizing to South Korea. And that's the reason why at the end of this exchange, we were more likely to believe that Japan was not likely to accept this partnership. But even if this clash was not the most important clash in this round, the second clash, to what extent does this partnership alienate China, and what are the harms associated with this? Because this clash was also quite important in this debate because according to the negative team at least, China is the most important broker of regional stability and peace between South Korea and North Korea, while the affirmative team also then suggests that, and this is where there's quite a bit of disagreement here, right? So the affirmative team is like, oh, we need to like ditch China because like of all these predatory loans and things like that, trying to distance themselves is important for South Korea, and also creating an alternative for ASEAN countries is quite important as well. Through the partnership of South Korea and Japan, they could potentially give loans as an alternative to the BRI. Okay, so quite important clash because teams very much disagree on what exactly is important in the dimensions of the debate around China. All right, let's discuss the first part of this exchange, which is this idea that there's a power, like the power broker. And the way that the negative team tries to ground the analysis is to suggest that South Korean citizens very much firstly have a reviewed preference, but also reviewed preference for China. There are lots of arguments for, sorry, not arguments, but there's quite a bit of analysis behind why that is true. But also like South South Korea's biggest trading partner, and that often means to say that there is a pretty decent relationship there to begin with. So intuitively, it seems true that there's some sort of relationship that's already existent that might be worth protecting. But the second thing then I think that happens is a challenge from the affirmative team on why exactly China is not it's not great. They're not a great actor for them. Talking about like the ideological alignment. But I think the response that we get from, again, the negative side is that it's unclear why the liberal democracies shouldn't or that liberal democracies don't engage with. It's not true that liberal democracies don't engage with these autocratic actors. The US does this quite regularly. So it's unclear as to why that was the more significant reason that could be used to outweigh this potential argument around like around China not being a great partner for South Korea. The other thing I think then that happens is there was a lack of weighing in this debate because the affirmative team says that there are lots of macroeconomic benefits that we care about through this partnership, but it is unclear why the citizens of South Korea or South Korea's why this is something they care more about and especially in the face of the negative team saying that you are going to have a lot of anxiety, and I think there's quite a bit of emotional impacting that was kind of left unresponded to in terms of weighing, especially. So it's unclear why, for the purposes of this debate, the macroeconomic benefits potentially that the affirmative team puts out was more likely to be logically prior for the consideration of what was important for South Korea's direct interest. So I think that explication of what South Korean citizens want did give the negative team a bit of an edge in this part. So what other things then happened in this exchange under the partnership and alienating China? Other things that came under this clash included this idea that China is a bad and horrifyingly, I guess, unethical trading partner because of their flagrant violations of things like IP laws. I think this was the strongest reason that the affirmative team proposed for why China isn't a great partner. I think this was the strongest reason that I think was also resurrected in the affirmative's reply. The way we saw this play out was that, firstly, given the characterization that that China is South Korea's biggest trading partner, it seems that consideration seems implicitly less important, given that China also, as pointed out by the negative team, is the biggest trading partner for many other countries in the world. It's unclear why the IP laws thing should be logically prior as a consideration for South Korea's trading interests. So while it is true, or even if we accept that it is true that the IP laws or the flagrant violations or disrespect for the IP laws existed for China, it's unclear why that wasn't the overriding consideration for the purposes of South Korea's interests in this round. That was the reason why, even in that small exchange, we didn't think that had a massive impact in terms of shaping the way that this clash unfolded for the purposes of who won this clash. The other part of this clash also included this idea of reducing loans for increasing loans that are more ethical for ASEAN. Because the characterization we get from the affirmative team is that ASEAN basically is trying to move away from China. And therefore, this rise of, I guess, the partnership provides an alternative set of banking loans for ASEAN. The way it was framed seemed very largely to be about ASEAN. So it's, even though I don't think the negative team does a very clear response to this, but it's also unclear why this response, it's unclear why this impact is important for South Korea's interest. There's no expectation for why this was going to be a good thing for South Korea. And I think that was crucially something that meant that even though it was not responded to directly by the negative side, or not responded to in the most complete fashion, that's the reason why this was less important for this for considering who won this particular clash. So at the end of this clash, I think the panel is convinced that this partnership is more likely to alienate China at the end of the day, and it's more likely to inflame the regional instability, and that creates a massive problem potentially for North Korea, because absent of all these things, South Korea is in a nice nexus of being in this optimal state between being, I guess, both China's trading partner and also the US's important military and trading partner too. So the third clash then, will South Korea benefit from this relationship? So assuming that, assuming that Japan is able to join this partnership and taking the affirmative's case at its best case scenario, what we would suggest is that the characterization battle between a rivalrous relationship versus a complementary relationship between South Korea and Japan was quite important in breaking this deadlock, because I think the affirmative team wanted to suggest that there was a lot of complementary ways for this relationship to play out between Japan and South Korea. One of the things they point out would be the Mitsubishi and Hyundai example. Mitsubishi creates planes and Hyundai creates cars, but it's unclear exactly why those things are going to play out as complementary things like that, because both companies generally produce cars, but also more importantly, I think the response we get from the negative side is basically that these companies, Mitsubishi and Hyundai, they are all quite similar. The economies are so similar such that it is more likely that they are not going to do things for example, I guess, like synergize with each other to plug up gaps in each other's economies. They have very similar gaps. And so what it will be more likely to look like, instead of having all those benefits from innovation and cross-pollination, instead of all that, what you're more likely to see is things like brain drain, because of that very similar characterization posed by both teams, which is that there's an aging population both in South Korea and Japan, something that I think Third Affirmative agrees with. And as a consequence of that, that brain drain actually becomes more likely as a situation. So there's a competition for limited resource of manpower. So therefore, I was more likely at the end of this debate to buy the characterization that this relationship was more likely to be rivalrous as opposed to be complementary. The other thing that happens under this clash is this characterization of the US being an unreliable partner and the West being distracted by Ukraine and things like that. But I think the negative team forwards quite a number of reasons why the the US cares about what happens in the Korean Peninsula, given that often like that nuclear warfare being a very real plausibility in that region seems to always mean that you're more likely to come back in these cases. They are also able to provide some counter characterization for what those US interests economically in that region looks like because of existing trading ties. It's unclear for me why the pivot away from South Korea is as significant in severity as the affirmative tries to characterize in this round. So at the end of this debate, I think the mitigation that the negative side is able to do to explain why there's not so much not so much apathy around the Korean Peninsula because of other world events. I was more likely to believe that that's less likely to be a problem for the purposes of this debate. And that's the reason why I was more likely to believe that at the end of this debate, South Korea was less likely to benefit from this relationship, assuming that the affirmative's best case scenario emerged, which was that Japan, ended up accepting this partnership and buying in. Yeah, so for those reasons, the debate went to the negative side.